Imagine lining up for a single bag of flour and walking straight into a battlefield. Within days of its launch, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's aid centers morphed from what should have been life-saving hubs into killing grounds. How did a US and Israeli-backed relief operation become one of the deadliest traps in Gaza's history? Let's look into it. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, is a US and Israeli-backed aid distribution mechanism launched in the Gaza Strip on May 27th of this year, after Israel partially lifted an 11-week aid blockade. GHF operates a network of food distribution points in Israeli-controlled zones of Gaza, using private US security and logistic contractors to deliver aid, largely bypassing the UN-led system. The United Nations and major NGOs immediately voiced concern that the scheme was inherently unsafe. Unlike the hundreds of small distribution sites previously run by UN agencies and NGOs, the GHF set up only a few large centers, forcing massive crowds of desperate civilians to converge in militarized, fenced-in zones. From its inception, UN officials warned that restricting aid to such controlled points would endanger civilians. UN humanitarian chief Felipe Lanzarini denounced the GHF distribution scheme as a, quote, sadistic death trap that turned the search for food into a massive hunt of people in total impunity. He says snipers open fire randomly on crowds as if they are given a license to kill. Humanitarian groups similarly cautioned that Palestinians in Gaza face a, quote, impossible choice: starve or risk being shot under this new aid model. Within days of the GHF's launch, reports of deadly attacks at these aid distribution sites began to emerge. Multiple credible sources, including eyewitnesses, humanitarian organizations, and even GHF's own contractors, attest to Israeli forces and US private guards using violent force against unarmed Palestinian crowds. Human rights monitors documented that Israeli army snipers and other soldiers repeatedly opened fire on crowds of starving civilians at GHF food pickup points. Euromed Human Rights Monitor even found that on June 3rd, Israeli snipers in Rafah deliberately targeted starving civilians with direct gunfire, mostly to the head. At least 27 Palestinians were killed and 90 injured in one incident alone. A field investigator recounted that an Israeli drone first surveilled the crowd, then troops suddenly opened fire from elevated positions. Quote, people came looking for food, but they went back dead or wounded. Witnesses consistently described indiscriminate gunfire. By early June, over 600 Palestinians have been killed or injured in 1 week near 3 GHF centers, leading Euromed to conclude these sites, quote, function as killing zones used to deliberately target and execute civilians. Palestinian survivors describe heavy military hardware being used to terrorize aid seekers. According to numerous reports, Israeli armored vehicles and tanks have been present at these sites and have fired upon crowds. For example, on July 19th at the Zakim crossing in northern Gaza, Israeli tanks and snipers opened fire on thousands of civilians waiting for a UN flower convoy. The UN World Food Program confirmed that as a food convoy arrived, the surrounding crowd came under fire from Israeli tanks, snipers, and other gunfire. This was even despite prior assurances that armed forces would not engage along the route. Drones have also been used offensively. Witnesses say Israeli quadcopter drones hovered over aid lines, sometimes firing on or above the crowds. Drones even blasted loudspeakers taunting the hungry. A man recalls a drone flying overhead broadcasting, "You animals, go away, the supply is out." Such accounts indicate a coordinated military response, using tanks, aerial drones, and ground troops to disperse and punish crowds at civilian aid sites. The GHF sites are guarded by private security contractors who are largely American, some of whom have come forward to describe the abusive conduct. The Associated Press interviewed 2 US contractors who confirmed that guards regularly use live ammunition, stun grenades, and pepper spray on crowds of Palestinians drones at GHF distribution points. Heavily armed staff members appeared to be doing whatever they wanted. Many hires were unvetted and seemed to have an open license to act with total impunity. On July 17th, at a GHF site in Khan Yunis, American guards deployed pepper spray and tear gas the moment the gate opened, causing panic and a deadly stampede. An 18-year-old survivor recounted, American guards started spraying pepper spray and firing gas bombs, and the people began stampeding through the corridor. In the chaos, 21 people were killed, including 15 whom suffocated in the crush and many more injured. Another eyewitness confirmed pepper spray and gas bombs were fired by American guards and Israeli quadcopters above. Some victims in that incident also had gunfire wounds, suggesting that live fire accompanied the tear gas. In an earlier case, Euromed Monitor verified that a foreign mercenary employed by a US security firm shot and killed a civilian at a Rafah aid site in June. Tear gas was repeatedly used to drive away famished people. A former American GHF security guard who quit in disgust told media that one contractor sprayed an entire can of pepper spray into a Palestinian's face at close range.
The UG security personnel wanted to get the Palestinians off the site. So they start yelling, hey, let's go, let's leave. This guy wasn't armed, he wasn't a threat. So this UG contractor sprayed an entire can of pepper spray.
These insider accounts of the use of mercenary-style force, pepper spraying, beating, and even shooting civilians come from the very personnel meant to oversee orderly aid distribution. In addition to regular Israeli units and US contractors, Israel has even deployed a proxy militia to control aid lines. Israeli officials have openly acknowledged creating an armed tribal militia known as the Abu Shabab gang to help manage Gaza. Euromed Monitor reports this gang worked in direct coordination with Israeli forces, terrorizing crowds and even looting aid. In one incident west of Rafah, gang members opened fire on a hungry crowd, killing at least 14 civilians before retreating behind Israeli lines when the situation got out of hand. Israeli troops then joined in with, quote, random and direct gunfire from jeeps, drones, and even helicopters, dispersing the crowd and adding to the bloodshed. Notably, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu personally confirmed the formation of this militia for the Gaza operation. Euromed warns that these armed gangs, under Israeli direction, deliberately open fire on civilian crowds at aid centers, turning hunger relief into a massive slaughterhouse scenario. The human toll of incidents at GHF sites has been devastating, with hundreds of Palestinians killed and thousands injured in less than 2 months. By late June, Save the Children reported that since May 27th, more than 500 Palestinians have been killed and at least 3,000 injured by Israeli forces while trying to access aid at a GHF aid site. Children were frequently among the victims. Save the Children found that children were killed or injured in over half of the 19 deadly aid incidents documented in the first month of GHF operations. In one tragic account, a Save the Children manager noted that some Gaza children, having lost parents to sniper fire, told us that they wanted to die, to be in paradise because there is food and water. By early July, the Gaza Health Ministry announced that at least 743 Palestinians were killed and 4,891 injured while seeking aid at a GHF distribution site in the preceding weeks. Around the same time, the UN Office for High Commissions for Human Rights found that by mid-July, at least 875 civilians were killed at or near distribution points in the prior 6 weeks. The majority of those fatalities occurred at GHF-run sites. A smaller portion, about 200, were killed along routes of other aid convoys. The death toll continued to climb sharply in the second half of July due to several mass casualty incidents. On July 17th, a catastrophic crush and live fire incident at the GHF's Khan Yunis Center killed 21 people, 15 by suffocation and at least 6 by gunshots, with dozens injured. Just 2 days later, on July 19th and 20th, Israeli forces carried out a series of deadly shootings around aid sites. 92 aid seekers were gunned down in a single day, 79 people shot dead by troops at Zakim crossing in northern Gaza, and 13 others shot near aid pickup points in Rafah and Khan Yunis. Medics described the scene at Zakim as carnage, with no ambulances available for dozens of bleeding victims. By July 21st and 22nd, the head of UNRWA reported over 1,000 starving Palestinians had been killed at aid sites since the end of May. Gaza's health ministry tallied more than 1,020 aid seekers killed and more than 6,500 injured by Israeli fire at GHF GHF distribution points as of July 22nd. It's important to note that casualties have escalated over time, with some of the deadliest single incidents occurring in July. Many of the victims are children. Save the Children noted that children have been shot in over 50% of these mass casualty events at food sites. Not only are people dying from the chaos and stampedes from bullets, but Gaza's hospitals are being overflooded with patients from these incidents. Even the families of victims face unbearable trauma. The climate is so severe that many Gazans say that they would rather starve than go to a GHF site knowing that it could be a death sentence. Yet thousands feel they have no choice but to face risk for a bag of flour. Far from being a neutral facilitator of aid, the GHF itself has come under intense scrutiny for its role in creating this deadly environment. Numerous humanitarian observers accuse the GHF of intentionally or recklessly setting up systems that endanger civilians. GHF chose to establish distribution centers in remote exposed areas under military control, often requiring displaced people to walk long distances through war-torn landscapes. In Khan Yunis, thousands were penned into a 7-meter wide gate area. The fenced corridor with gas bombs raining down and people being pushed through became a death trap. Because armed Israeli units and GHF's own guards surround these sites, civilians inside the perimeter have nowhere to flee when the shooting or stampedes erupt. Amnesty conducted an investigation concluding that Israel, by maintaining this deadly, dehumanizing, and ineffective militarized aid scheme instead of allowing safe UN-run aid, has turned aid seeking into a booby trap for desperate, starved Palestinians. In other words, the very structure of the GHF system is accused of being a setup that predictably yields civilian carnage. The fact that UN agencies refuse to work with the GHF reinforces doubts about the foundation's credibility. GHF is a private entity with close ties to the US and Israeli governments. Critics question its transparency and motives, especially as it has restricted media and independent access to its sites. This secrecy has led many to state it is slaughter masquerading as aid. Israeli authorities dispute the narrative of deliberate attacks on civilians, instead blaming Hamas and rioters for the bloodshed. However, their responses have evolved as casualty counts mounted. Israel's foreign ministry rejected international criticism of its aid policy as disconnected from reality, insisting that any suffering in Gaza is the fault of Hamas. In a July 21st statement responding to Western diplomats, Israel said its joint condemnation fails to recognize Hamas's role and responsibility for the situation and sends the wrong message to Hamas. Israeli officials maintain that Hamas militants attempt to loot or disrupt aid, necessitating Israeli force. The IDF claims it operates GHF centers to prevent the aid from falling into the hands of Hamas militants, who they allege use the crowds for cover. Following one incident, the IDF tweeted that soldiers fired warning shots to remove immediate threats. However, no evidence of armed threats among the crowds has been provided, and witnesses as well as the UN officials strongly refute these claims. The UN World Food Program explicitly stated that people shot at Zakim were simply trying to access food on the brink of starvation, with no indications of weapons among them. By early July, with hundreds of deaths drawing global alarm, even Israeli officials began to publicly acknowledge problems. On July 1st, an Israeli military spokesperson admitted that Palestinian civilians had been harmed at aid centers and said that the army had issued new instructions following lessons learned. As of July 24th, there is no indication of any independent Israeli investigation or accountability for the killings at GHF aid sites. Although the IDF said it was reviewing certain mass casualty events, no results have been made public. Israeli officials continue to defend the concept of GHF. They cite the huge volumes of aid the GHF claims to have delivered, while dismissing reports of atrocities as misinformation or exaggerations. For example, the GHF told Reuters earlier that such incidents have not occurred on its sites, and accused the UN of lying when UNRWA and others presented evidence of sniper killings. Israeli diplomats doubled down that the IDF only fires in self-defense. The IDF's official stance on the July 19th Zakim massacre was that troops fired warning shots because they perceived an unnamed threat, and that the reported number of casualties does not align with the information held by the IDF. Israel's public posture has been to deny intentional targeting of civilians, attribute any gunfire to security needs, and to shift the focus to Hamas, even as international observers say there is no sign of Hamas fighters present in the crowds of these starving starving families. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's leadership, which includes Americans working with the Trump administration, has supported staunchly the program and denies all allegations of misconduct by its personnel. GHF insists that no lethal force is used by its staff. In response to the AP's expose and a whistleblower interview, GHF issued a statement calling the accuser a disgruntled former contractor, terminated for misconduct, and claiming it conducted an internal investigation that concluded the claims are categorically false. GHF stated, "At no point were civilians under fire at a GHF distribution site. The gunfire heard in the video was confirmed to have originated from the IDF. The gunfire was not directed at individuals, nor was anyone shot or injured." This response effectively blames any shooting on the Israeli army, not GHF guards. Even if one accepts that framing, it amounts to admitting that Israeli forces did fire near the crowds, though GHF says not at individuals. The GHF also said that the contractor caught on video shouting at people has been since removed, and emphasized its zero-tolerance policy for misbehavior. However, journalists noted that they could not independently verify some contractors' claims. Reporters are barred from GHF sites by the Israeli military. The GHF and its supporters assert that the GHF model is necessary given the circumstances. They argue that traditional aid was failing due to looting by Hamas or gangs. The Israeli and US narrative is that GHF is the only entity managing to get substantial amount of aid in, implying that UN agencies either couldn't or wouldn't deliver to starving Palestinians. A US State Department spokesperson on July 3rd praised GHF as the only entity that has gotten food and aid into Gaza, while the Trump administration pledged $30 million in direct funding to support GHF's work. GHF's own statements to the media highlight tens of millions of meals delivered and accuse other humanitarian groups of having nearly all of their aid looted by militants or Hamas. In a defensive remark to Reuters, GHF said, "Instead of blocking and throwing insults from the sidelines, we would welcome other humanitarian groups to join us and to feed the people in Gaza." GHF has not addressed why its operations are resulting in so many deaths, besides attributing those deaths to factors outside of its control. The Gaza Health Ministry states that scores of those killed were simply queuing for bread or flour. The Palestinian Authority and PLO have also raised their alarms internationally. PA President Mahmoud Abbas and the Foreign Ministry in Ramallah have referred to these incidents as part of Israel's broader genocidal campaign in Gaza. On July 24th, France's government noted that Abbas had urgently called on the world to stop the indefensible killing of civilians at aid distribution points. France's foreign ministry denounced Israel's targeting of civilians at aid sites. The Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and other regional bodies similarly issued statements condemning Israel's war crimes at these so-called humanitarian centers. Virtually every major international relief and human rights organization has spoken out. The United Nations agencies are unified in criticism. The World Food Program, whose own aid convoy was involved in the Sakim tragedy, publicly disputed Israel's accounts and confirmed that Israel fires on civilians. WFP stressed that victims at Sakim were people on the brink of starvation. It's important to note that UN officials have stockpiled ample food near in Egypt that could feed Gaza's population safely, but Israel's restrictions at the GHF's exclusivity have prevented its distribution. UN leadership consistently calls for Israel to lift the siege and allow UN agencies to handle aid safely and with dignity. The International Committee of Red Cross has repeatedly urged all parties to protect civilians and ensure humanitarian access. The Palestine Red Crescent Society has also been on the ground responding. Medics have described these events as chaos where even ambulances struggle to reach the injured. Groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have framed the GHF-related atrocities as part of a larger violation in Gaza. Notably, on June 30th, a coalition of 171 NGOs, including Oxfam, Save the Children, NRC, Amnesty, and many more, issued a joint declaration urging world governments to press Israel to halt the GHF scheme and restore UN-coordinated aid. The global response to the Gaza aid site killings has been growing outrage. By July 2025, even many of Israel's traditional allies and supporters publicly condemned the events at the GHF distribution points. On July 21st, the foreign ministers of 25 Western nations, including France, the UK, Germany's EU partners, Canada, Canada, Australia, and more released a remarkable joint statement demanding Israel immediately end the war in Gaza and change its aid strategy. They specifically criticized the drip feeding of aid and the inhumane killing of civilians, including hundreds near food distribution sites. This statement said it was horrifying that more than 800 civilians have been killed while seeking aid. The US government under President Trump remained a notable outlier in not publicly condemning Israel for these incidents. In fact, as mentioned, the Trump administration increased funding to GHF and defended it. However, some American voices did express concern. Media reports suggest quiet unease even within US security circles about the optics of Americans involved in shooting Palestinians. The US ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, however, harshly criticized the joint Allied statement, calling it disgusting to blame Israel and saying that it was irrational given Hamas's role. Public protests and social media campaigns have also responded. The hashtag Gaza is starving trended globally in mid-July as images and videos of the aid site chaos spreads. NGOs like Jewish Voices for Peace, Islamic Release, and others have held demonstrations calling the GHF scheme a death trap aid scam and urging the US to withdraw support. The period of June 1st to July 24th saw repeated violent incidents at GHF humanitarian sites in Gaza that resulted in staggering Palestinian civilian casualties. Extensive research and reports confirm that Israeli soldiers, including snipers and tank crews, aided by US private security contractors, did in fact shoot at and assault Palestinian civilians who were attempting to receive aid. The GHF-run sites have been widely condemned as a deadly failure, even as a deliberate death trap. International organizations and many governments have responded with outrage, calling the GHF scheme to be terminated and for independent investigations into the killings to be held. As of July 24th, 2025, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's aid distribution experiment is viewed by the humanitarian community as a sadistic and grossly illegal enterprise that turned hunger relief into further bloodshed, prompting urgent demands for Israel to revert to safe, neutral aid channels and to allow for full accountability for Israel's atrocities committed in Gaza.